again, it's a game of humiliation and abasement. He wants to make his adversary get down on both knees, beg for mercy, and then he calls it off, right? The spectacle of war, more than war itself, or at least the political concomitants of war, matter most to him. So if he can say, I destroyed Iran, quote unquote, just like he said he obliterated the nuclear program, which wasn't quite true, that'll be enough for him.
Hi, I'm Maddie Hale and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we're speaking about the updates with the Russia-Ukraine war. We're speaking about this conflict potentially happening in Iran and a few of the Epstein files, latest news on that. So I'm bringing in my guest today, editor of The Insider, Michael Weiss. Michael, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Yeah, happy to be back, Maddie.
Let's kick off with this really detailed report from The Guardian. They're reporting that the CIA and MI6 uncovered detailed plans for Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine months before February 2022. So they were using intercepted communications, satellite imagery, and human intelligence, even warning Putin directly. This report says that they have interviewed, The Guardian interviewed over 100 senior intelligence officials from various countries, and they found many European governments and President Zelensky's government initially dismissed the warnings as unlikely, which meant that they weren't prepared for this invasion when it eventually happened nearly 4 years next week. So this is despite the fact that Western intelligence proved accurate that Moscow had every intention to try and seize Kyiv and target President Zelensky. I mean, Michael, if this is true, this is a bombshell report.
It is, although, I mean, a lot of it is stuff that we already knew and sort of had seeped out in reporting in the last 4 years, which is no discredit to Sean Walker. I mean, it's a fabulous piece of journalism, over 100 sources queried over the past several years, and it really is the most comprehensive portrait we have of, the tick-tock leading up to the full-scale invasion. But yeah, I was in Kyiv about 6 weeks before the war started, with a simple objective, which was to query as many Ukrainian intelligence and military and political officials as I could to find out why they weren't panicking when it seemed everyone else in the free world was. The U.S. had been, as Sean points out, declassifying intelligence in real time to a degree that it has never done before. And basically classified was winding up on the front page of the New York Times for several weeks leading up to the war, anticipating that it was going to happen. And yet Ukrainians maintained a sense of equanimity. And, although you got different kind of granular perspectives, the broad overview that I came away with was nobody thought Putin was stupid enough to do this, because everyone in Ukraine knew that the Ukrainians would fight like mad, and that the Russians, as one Ukrainian MP put it, would choke on this country. So you have an interesting situation in which the United States and the UK got the inevitability of war correct, but then they cocked up how that war was going to go. And why did they do that? Because they took the Russian military estimation of itself at face value. They bought into this kind of bright, shiny new army that then Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu had been touting for many years. They legitimately thought that what the Russians said they were going to do, and what they firmly believed themselves capable of doing, was going to be a fait accompli. Whereas the Ukrainians, and it is true that some Europeans and European intelligence services who are very intimately involved in Ukraine also rated the Ukrainians quite highly in this regard. But most Ukrainians, keep in mind, had already been at war with Russia for a decade. Right. And you had, I forget what percentage of the total population had served in some capacity at some point in that decade in a combat role. So they were quite experienced. They were quite battle hardened. They knew their adversary much better than the United States did in sort of face-to-face situation. And no Ukrainian I met in that 6-week period before the war thought this country was just simply going to roll over. Even if they lost, it was going to be a real battle. And I mean, indeed, we're here 4 years later. The Russians have lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Their economy is in tatters. And they still struggle to take the town of Pokrovsk, much less the entirety of Donbass, which is the reason that they're now engaged in these negotiations or these pantomime negotiations to try and get at the, sort of in diplomatic fora that which they cannot obtain militarily on the battlefield. So the Ukrainians were wrong, but for the right reason. The war did happen, but Putin was mad to wage it because look at what it's got him.
Absolutely. And all those indications in the early days was that Ukraine would fall within a matter of weeks, and they themselves have proved them wrong. But where we're at right now, Michael, is that the US has US mediated peace talks in Geneva have wrapped up. There was discussion about territorial concession, but I want to get your thoughts on a few quotes from President Zelensky this week. So he basically said, emotionally, people will never forgive this. Never. They will never forgive me. They will never forgive the United States if he concedes land, including Donbass and including regions that Russia doesn't even occupy yet. But what do you make of this quote? Because when he says things like this publicly, it seems clear that while this is meant to be mediated by the US, it seems as if the US might be pushing Ukraine to do this.
Well, we know that the U.S. is pushing Ukraine to make concessions, particularly territorial concessions, to give up the rest of Donbass, because the Americans have been led to believe by Putin, and by when I say the Americans, what I really mean is Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy to Russia, who has absolutely no experience with Russian history, doesn't understand the part of the world he's negotiating over, and who was hand-selected by Putin to be the envoy to discuss this issue with Putin, simply because of that fact. I mean, he's got no background in statecraft, no political nous. He's a real estate developer, but very close to Trump, or has Trump's ear, is a confidant of Trump, and sees matters of the fate of millions as something like an outer borough real estate deal, nothing that can't be sorted out in a boardroom, right? So the Russians have convinced Witkoff, look, if you just give us Donbass, we'll agree to whatever. And that seems to have Trump has seized on that one issue, which is why he continually says that it's the Ukrainians who are being intransigent and they must come to the table and they must make accommodations. I mean, keep in mind, Maddie, the original American plan was an unconditional ceasefire along the current line of contact. The Ukrainians accepted immediately. Russia did not. Then we had a summit in Anchorage, and the Russian Foreign Ministry and the Russian spooks, at least the ones that talk publicly on Twitter, seem to suggest that there were some kind of secret protocols that were agreed to in Anchorage, and that the whole Witkoff Ukraine plan, such as it is now, these 20 points, which were whittled down from 28, seem to undermine or violate those protocols. Whatever. The U.S. intelligence assessment has maintained consistently throughout this process of the last year, and indeed just recently, I think a few days ago, Reuters reported, the U.S. intelligence assessment is the same, that Russia has no intent of stopping the war. Putin's demands continue to be maximalist. He wants all of Ukraine. Whatever he can't gobble up at the end of a bayonet, he would like to take diplomatically. So, in other words, political capture of Kyiv, if not tanks, encircling the capital yet again. But the United States maintains, no, or rather Donald Trump maintains, he's sincere. He really wants this war to end. All of the pain and suffering and the lost lives on both sides, that really affects Vladimir Putin deeply, according to Trump. And the Ukrainians, I think, are getting to a point of utter exasperation. They've done everything that they are able to do to meet the Americans, on their own terms. They are saying that they would even put to a referendum the question of territory. They wouldn't cede Donbass to Russia, but they might withdraw their own forces from Donbass and create a kind of economic free zone or a sort of no man's land that neither side could occupy as a compromise. And the Americans don't seem to think that sort of is satisfactory. But Zelensky is quite right when he points out, look, you can't have a referendum, you can't have elections until you have locked-in security guarantees. I mean, how are you going to have any kind of plebiscite in this country when bombs are raining down on civilians and on soldiers on a 24-hour basis, right? So I think he's incredibly frustrated because he sees the Americans as having been a reliable ally. Joe Biden spent upwards of $60 billion on security assistance to Ukraine. Donald Trump in the first year in office, has not authorized any major new drawdown authorities, security packages to Ukraine. He does not donate or give anything to Ukraine. He makes a big deal that it's the European allies of NATO that buy kit from the Americans to donate to Ukraine. The Kiel Institute, which is a German think tank, showed that U.S. support in terms of material support for Ukraine has dropped 99% in the last year. And that shortfall has been made up quite rapidly by the Europeans, which have now increased their hardware, their military support for Ukraine upwards of 60%. So you have this weird state of affairs, Maddie, where Donald Trump says, he sort of talks out of both sides of his head. He says, on the one hand, Europe must step up, spend more on defense. This crisis, this war is happening in their own backyard. They should be the ones to take their fortunes and the issues of security into their own hands. Europe has done that. And yet, Europe pays the bills, and yet Europe does not have a seat at the table, as it were. Europe is not leading these negotiations. And you're beginning to see Europeans also frustrated, like Zelensky, in saying, the Polish foreign minister, Radek Sikorski, has said, if we're the ones footing the bill for everything, why aren't we the ones leading these negotiations? Why is Donald Trump still doing it?
And it has been the question as of late why this is happening, because these polls and these graphs are going around just showing everyone how little financial aid has been given to Ukraine from the US side. And as of late, the Washington Post has been reporting that many analysts have said that Moscow's demands in these trilateral meetings are far wider than just territorial swaps or gains. But this is not what the US side is saying. Like, we see Steve Witkoff come out and say we're in the final 10% of discussions. We've got the final hurdle. Sometimes he says it's land. Sometimes he doesn't name what it is. We assume it is territorial concessions. But what do you think? Do you think the Kremlin in these meetings might be demanding things that we saw from that original 2022 proposal, which is, of course, things like abandonment of NATO, demilitarization, making Russia, the Russian language, the main language, recognizing Crimea as Russia, all these things that made up that very criticized original proposal that Putin put forward. And it's not just territorial discussions. They're talking about the way that the US side say it is.
Yeah, in that proposal, the 28 points that were put forward, they weren't even put forward by Putin. They were put forward by Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, who is one of many confidants of Putin. Dmitriev is sort of part of the family because his wife is the best friend of Putin's older daughter. But Dmitriev is one boyar among many, right? He doesn't necessarily get the final say as to what's going to happen. So he put forward this 28-point plan, which talked about no further NATO expansion, kind of relitigating the post-Cold War security architecture for Europe, economic relief. So the biggest thing that the Russians need right now is sanctions relief, because it is true that sanctions are taking a big toll on their economy. You've got, the one, to his credit, Donald Trump did issue sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil. That has led to a kind of run on those entities in terms of companies not wanting to transact with them because they don't want to be cut out of the U.S. dollar system. The U.S. is also going after the shadow fleet, which is the tankers that Russia uses usually under false flags to transport its oil around the world to evade previous sanctions. The EU continues to pass sanctions packages. So, these things are doing damage to Russia's economy. However, not enough damage that Putin has altered his calculus in terms of what he wants out of Ukraine. So I think with these negotiations is, if the Ukrainians say yes, 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 they get to a certain point, and the Americans are like, great, we're, as Witkoff says, 10%, before the end zone here. What happens is the Russians come back with something that sort of flips the script. One indication for me that these talks were going off the rails was the dispatching of Mr. Mendinsky back as one of the lead negotiators on the Russian delegation. I mean, this guy is sort of a barking ideologue. He's like Putin. He likes to lecture his audience about history, both modern and ancient. I mean, he's a toad. He just bloviates, right? I think the Ukrainians are like, look, we were making some progress, perhaps in terms of technical details, lines on the map, that kind of thing, prisoner swaps. And in comes this guy to sort of basically, throw the toys out the pram and say, no, this is something much greater than just Ukraine. We want to, deal with the entire, array of NATO forces and blah, blah, blah. And, the Ukrainians, again, rightly feel that they're being shaken down, not just by the Russians, which they're quite used to and accustomed to. I mean, they're at war with Russia, but more for them treacherously by the Americans, who, as I say, used to be an ally and now, at best, is a neutral observer, if at worst, is actually sort of acting as defense counsel for the Russian Federation.
Well, I wonder if that's changed at all, just for our audience. Something that happened in the last day or so is that US fighter jets had to intercept multiple of Russia's warplanes as they entered Alaska's air defense identification zone. So while they stayed out of actual US airspace and stuck in international airspace, NORAD said that it was part of Moscow's continued military signaling near the Arctic. I mean, there's no coincidence when it comes to Russia's warplanes flying off the coast of Alaska. But do you think that they were testing US response the same way they'd done with European nations a couple of months ago?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's important to understand there's a kind of paradox at play here. On the one hand, Russia sees an opportunity with Donald Trump back in the White House. He's very amenable to their grievances and to their national interest and their security concerns and all that. I mean, he's the most pro-Russian president the United States has had in a very, very long time. On the other hand, there are elements within the Kremlin, the Siloviki, the security apparatus, the kind of the uber hawks and ultra-nationalist elements, who will never believe that the United States, even led by a guy like Trump, has an interest in strategic realignment or making nice with Moscow. They always believe that America remains the main adversary, and no matter what, they're at a state of war or great power confrontation with the U.S. And again, when I say that America is at best neutral and at worst, carrying water for Russia, that's true, but it is also true that because of the economic penalties that have been enacted, because of the intelligence or covert capabilities that are still very much in play here. I mean, the U.S. still provides targeting packages to the Ukrainians with respect not only to Russian positions in occupied Ukraine, but also with respect to targets inside Russian Federation territory. One of the reasons we knew within seconds that Putin's claim that his residence in Valdai had been targeted by a Ukrainian drone strike several weeks ago was false is that the CIA actually provides the targeting packages to Ukraine drone operators. And a U.S. intelligence official told me nothing came within 50 kilometers of Putin's residence, right? So you have this thing where I think even Trump is not quite across just how deeply involved the U.S. is at all levels in keeping Ukraine's defenses chugging along. And I think that's the great kind of worry for the Ukrainian side is, okay, fine, America doesn't want to give us weapons or financial aid, and it's all the Europeans that are footing the bill for that. But we still need the United States for some things. And if the United States forsakes us, we're in a very bad way here. So that's the reason Zelensky continues to play along in this sort of shadow game of diplomacy with Witkoff and Kushner and with Trump. He can't afford to just tell them to F off. But, again, Putin's main objective here, it's not to settle the war. It's not to have some grand peace deal. It's certainly not to have another summit like Alaska, which was a busted flush. Putin's objective is to play for time, to stretch this process out as long as possible. And as long as he does that, Trump will be convinced that sectoral or secondary sanctions using tariffs, the Lindsey Graham, Richard Blumenthal bill, which is basically dead in the Senate and in the House. These things will all be kept in reserve but never actually implemented. There will be no new weapon systems given to Ukraine. Donald Trump won't get so angry that he'll do something really provocative or untoward to Russia. So that's Putin's objective.
Well, Michael, on the note of, getting angry, we saw the way that Trump and Trump and JD Vance really went after Zelensky last February in this Oval Office showdown. We see leaders get on the wrong side of him when they go against him. But it's funny how Putin seems to come out unscathed when he does something similar. And I want to read out this thing from Putin, basically strongly condemning the U.S. oil blockade of Cuba. He publicly says this is a special period with new sanctions. You know how I feel about this. We do not accept anything like this. We've always been on Cuba's side in its struggle for independence, for the right to follow its own path of development. We've always supported the Cuban people. We know how difficult these past few decades have been for the Cuban people as they fought for their right to live by their own rules and defend their national interests. I mean, despite the sanctimonious irony of a of a comment like that, should this not be enough to infuriate Trump, to piss him off, to see Putin publicly condemning his own policy against Cuba and ignite some sort of condemnation?
No, I mean, the Russians had backed Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, provided him with air defense systems and other weapons platforms and other forms of assistance, didn't stop Trump from snatching Maduro in the dead of night and rendering him to a Brooklyn courthouse. The Russians were not very keen on the United States dropping bunker busting bombs on Iran's nuclear program, but we did it anyway. They're certainly not keen on the United States going to war with Iran yet again, possibly to assassinate the supreme leader and liquidate the upper echelons of the IRGC, but that might very well happen. So I think, we can sort of compartmentalize, or, the Russians see it as sort of opportunistic portfolios. In the Western Hemisphere, which this administration has made a big deal out of claiming to be America's fief, Donald Trump feels he can do whatever he likes. And, for him, that includes possibly invading Greenland or forcing the Danes to sell it. Elsewhere, it's a wrangle, it's a negotiation. But you're quite right. He never gets so upset at Putin that he really wants to take the hurt to Russia. I mean, we are at a situation now where, without any kind of kinetic operation, with the stroke of maybe not one pen, but several pens, the United States could bring Russia to its knees, just economically. We choose not to do that. And normal administrations, Democratic and Republicans, would choose not to do that for a variety of reasons. A fear of what chaos might lead to in Russia. This is a nuclear armed power, the rise of warlordism, civil war, weapons proliferation, you name it. There's all kinds of doomsday scenarios here as to why we wouldn't want to see Russia destroyed. But with Trump, I think it goes beyond that. Psychologically, he sees a kinship with Putin. In fact, I think that he suffers from an enormous deal of penis envy when it comes to Putin, because Putin is the kind of strongman authoritarian that Donald Trump only wishes he could be. But he can't, because there are still some checks and balances left in the United States, right? I mean, there's a real tropism toward this guy. And he likes the fact that Putin can just go in and invade a neighbor and take over sovereign European territory. I mean, again, what is Donald Trump trying to do with respect to Greenland? The same thing. He likes that Putin can kill or imprison his adversaries at will. Donald Trump only wishes he could. He's trying to jail his adversaries, but the courts have thrown those cases out. Not quite at the level of wanting to poison or liquidate them, but who knows? It's only a year in. We've got 3 more to go. So for some reason, Putin has really kind of sunk his tenterhooks into Donald Trump, and I think. I don't credit Putin with being a master strategist. He certainly wasn't a brilliant KGB case officer, but he has a base level of training, and he understands sort of the psychological vulnerabilities of his prey. He personally selected Steve Witkoff to be his interlocutor with respect to doing deals between the United States and Russia over Ukraine and other things. Why did he do that? Why wasn't it Keith Kellogg, who was designated the special envoy to Ukraine, who was meeting with Putin in the Kremlin? Because Kellogg is a U.S. general and a Cold Warrior who understands Russia. And Witkoff is not, right? And Donald Trump doesn't understand Russia. He only thinks he does. And that's the most dangerous kind of commander-in-chief to have.
Let's move over to Iran now. We, of course, saw this Axios report this week that said that we were just days away from a joint US-Israeli military operation in Iran. President Trump has now given a 10 or 15-day or so timeline to decide whether or not he will continue diplomacy or order a military strike. But, I mean, Michael, how likely is it that we will see the US head to war with Iran? It's impossible to kind of predict what is ahead, but when you see this US armada there, it should be somewhat of an indication. I mean, now analysts are saying that the US has assembled its largest military force in the Middle East since 2003 Iraq invasion. So this should be, what an effort for just a threat is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and also what expense to U.S. taxpayers to keep 2 aircraft carrier strike groups in the Gulf, and to have this armada and all of these assets in place and just waiting there, right? I mean, look, I think here too, it comes down to the psychology of Donald Trump. His administration, his term is not going so swimmingly, at least if you look at the polls. He's hovering in the 30 percentile for favorability or for approval. The economy here isn't doing so hot. There is a very good likelihood that the Republicans will lose the House in the midterm elections. There's an increasing chance, albeit a little more remote, that they might also lose the Senate, in which case there's going to be enormous amounts of gridlock for the remainder of Trump's second term. In his mind, this probably is the last, go round for him as president. So he wants his legacy. So he's tried and failed to get his Nobel Peace Prize, which he wanted because Barack Obama had it, just like he wanted the presidency because Barack Obama had it, and he made fun of Donald Trump at that White House Correspondents' Dinner or whatever it was. He's already got Maduro out. He's claimed victory in Venezuela. He's now in control of Venezuelan oil. Cuba is likely not long for this world, at least under the Castro regime, which is obtained for 60, 70 years. Marco Rubio is already in talks with Raul Castro's grandson, presumably for some kind of transitional process, because Cuba is descending even more and more into failed statehood, especially with the oil embargo that the U.S. has put in place. But the piece de resistance for Trump would be ending the Islamic Republic of Iran. And ending it, not really ending it per se, but being able to declare victory, mission accomplished, right? So what could that consist of? As I say, assassinating the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, taking out the upper echelon of the IRGC, annihilating the Iranian missile program, which is still quite formidable, and something that the Americans, the reason that they've had to assemble all of these assets in the region is to, be able to withstand whatever barrage of short and mid-range missiles the Iranians might fire at not only ourselves but our allies. To say at least that he went in on behalf of these brave and valiant protesters who, stared down besieged militiamen and were shot and tortured and arrested and hanged and so on and so forth. Again, it's the optics. This is a man whose entire being kind of is inextricably linked with television and the sort of spectacle of things as opposed to the nitty-gritty reality of them. So do I expect to see boots on the ground in Iran and a full-scale occupation? You mentioned, 2003, the Iraq War. No, he wouldn't do anything, so comprehensive and dangerous as that. But he would rain fire and fury down on Iran, humiliate.
But if the UK, sorry,
Yeah.
Michael, to interrupt, if the UK went as far as to block the US from using British bases for strikes on Iran, I wonder if that shows that at least British intelligence are taking the threat seriously.
Well, it also shows that the Brits don't necessarily want to get involved in a war in the Middle East, right? Because they would become co-combatants. There are ways around this. Again, the U.S. doesn't necessarily need to rely on British air bases. When we went into war in Iraq, we wanted to use Turkey as kind of a launch pad, and the Turks said no. So that's not going to stop Trump. And Trump, as we know, has absolutely no hesitation whatsoever picking fights with allies, or you could very well. He's already started tweeting against the UK, hasn't he? The Chagos and so on. So that I wouldn't see that as necessarily a disincentive. I think the real thing for him is, could he get a deal with the mullahs that he could say, I ended their nuclear program? Joe Biden didn't do it. Barack Obama didn't do it. George W. Bush didn't do it. I did it. If he can't get a deal, and it looks increasingly likely he won't, because the Iranians simply don't want to forfeit that program. That has become a sort of nationalist issue apart from anything else. He will take that program out kinetically, but he'll also do other things. Again, it's a game of humiliation and abasement. He wants to make his adversary get down on both knees, beg for mercy, and then he calls it off, right? The spectacle of war, more than war itself, or at least the political concomitants of war, matter most to him. So if he can say, I destroyed Iran, quote unquote, just like he said he obliterated the nuclear program, which wasn't quite true, that'll be enough for him. I think that's what we're seeing. You know, there's a certain momentum to this buildup, as you alluded to earlier, where it really can't be stopped. You know, I mean, I know things have been deferred, and people have this sort of, you know, oh, he's going to taco, Trump always chickens out kind of thing. But when it comes to things like this, he actually doesn't chicken out. He went after Qasem Soleimani in 2020, when that was a very extreme end of the spectrum of options he was presented by his intelligence community. He assassinated, you know, one of the most visible exponents of the Islamic Republic, a guy who had basically put together these proxy forces across the region, from Lebanese Hezbollah to consortium of Iraqi militias. And I think that actually was the first domino to fall, as it were, for, you know, Iran's longevity. After Soleimani, things have never quite been the same for Tehran. If Soleimani were still in place, October 7th might not have happened, Hezbollah might not have been wiped out, and Bashar al-Assad would probably still be in Damascus instead of playing video games in some apartment building in Moscow. So I think, you know, Trump feels kind of the wind at his back. And he doesn't, again, unlike other administrations, including the Bush administration, he doesn't seek by your leave from Congress or from allies or for anyone else. You know, maybe the Israelis would join in a campaign of this nature. It seems like they most certainly would here. That's all he needs. That's all he wants.
Let's end on a domestic level, Michael. We've got to talk about this viral moment from Les Wexner, who testified in a closed-door House Oversight Committee deposition. The clips are now surfacing because the House released them, but he was there over his ties to Jeffrey Epstein and the fact that he's, of course, been named in these Epstein files. But he speaks about, you know, what he knew about Epstein, their relationship. He admits to going to Epstein Island. But this is the hot mic moment where his lawyer offers him some advice on answering the question. So I'm going to play it here for our audience.
All the things were inventoried. That wasn't work for me or Jeffrey. It was just regularly done.
Answer another question. 5 words, okay? Answer.
So, Michael, it was, I mean, the two of them are laughing together, but it is an amusing moment to see this guy be told off by his attorney for being too talkative.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what a good attorney should do, right? No, to tell your client when to shut his mouth and not incriminate himself. Yeah, look, I mean, Epstein has become, you know, it's become this all-consuming story in the United States. It's become an all-consuming story in other parts of the world. I mean, the UK has just arrested, you know, a member of the royal family for, you know, disgracing the public office or whatever the technical crime committed was. It seems like other world leaders are paying a price for having been intimately involved with a convicted pedophile. But nobody in the United States so far has really suffered. Nobody's gone to jail. Nobody's certainly resigned from their position in government. I mean, Donald Trump appears in the Epstein files, I think, more than anybody. And he claims that he's been completely exonerated. And now you notice, I mean, the other thing that he likes to do when there's a crisis, and you know, Epstein is a crisis. It's actually splintered his MAGA movement. Remember, everybody in MAGA wanted the Epstein files completely released, and only a fraction have been released. And of that fraction, a lot of these files have been redacted. So they're not fully satisfied, his movement. So what is he doing now? Well, let's declassify everything that the United States intelligence community has got on space aliens and UFOs and extraterrestrials, and you know, because Barack Obama made some stray comment in a podcast. So he, you know, again, a new bright shiny object for people to look at over here. We're doing the X-Files now. You know, it was Pedo Island last month. This month it's the X-Files. Who knows what, you know, the season cliffhanger or finale will be the following month. Again, it pays to see Donald Trump as a creature of media and television, as I say. For him, this is like sweeps weeks. Yeah, but I mean, I don't know what will become ultimately of the whole Epstein saga. You know, it seems like there's just infinite amounts of emails and correspondence and data that snares everybody. I mean, Noam Chomsky, for Christ's sakes, has taken a tumble even among the ranks of the far left, because he was not only traveling with Jeffrey Epstein, but advising him on his PR handling of being a convicted pedo. I mean, you know, you can't make this stuff up. It's one of the dangerous things that we have here. I'm just going to end on this note. It seems like a lot of things that looked to be conspiracy theories yesterday just turn out to be, if anything, only scratching the surface of reality today. And that is only going to lead to the further degradation and lack of fidelity in institutions, right? Nobody in America trusts the media. Nobody certainly trusts government anymore. And that's going to lead to all sorts of health crises and public concerns. I mean, what will happen if there's another pandemic at this point? People are not going to believe what authorities are telling them.
A really valid point. I do agree with you that the Epstein files has opened this can of worms of a distrust in government, distrust in media, distrust in corporations, in big pharma. I couldn't agree with you more, and it's only the beginning. But Michael Weiss, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Sure.